From the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM and Brown College at the University of Virginia, this is Symposia. In the fall semester of 2024, Brown College faculty fellow Adrienne Ghaly and her fellow English professor Cristina Griffin gathered a group of Brown College residents to discuss their reading habits. Do students read for pleasure? How long can they read before losing focus? What role, if any, can AI play in our reading habits? On this episode of Symposia, we'll hear Adrienne and Cristina discuss some of their findings and their theories about the fluctuating role of reading in our society. And here to introduce this conversation with me is Kalela Williams, the director of the Virginia Center for the Book. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we are quickly approaching the Virginia Festival of the Book. Could you just tell us what that's all about?
So the festival is taking place March 20th through 23rd this year. The Virginia Festival of the Book is in its fourth decade. It's a program of Virginia Humanities and a program of the Virginia Center for the Book. We're going to have more than 100 authors visiting us this year. We have all kinds of genres of books. So whatever you're into, there's something for you at the 2025 Virginia Festival of the Book.
Why are books so important to you?
Oh my gosh, books are part of who I am. Books are part of my very humanity. I grew up going to libraries, to used bookstores. I just always loved reading, and I always loved writing, and I always loved stories and transporting myself into a different world. I think that books connect us to one another in a way that nothing else can. Even though reading is a very solitary activity, books bring us into the minds and the thoughts and the ideas of other people.
Something that the guests of this podcast will talk a lot about is the community forming around books, and you're the director of the Virginia Center of the Book. Could you tell us a little bit about what that center does?
Yes, the Virginia Center for the Book celebrates and promotes the book. And that could be the art of the book. For instance, we have a book art studio and program because, books are art. They have always been art. And then we do year-round literary programming. And we do that everywhere from Charlottesville, Virginia to Lovingston, Virginia to Hampton Roads to Northern Virginia. We're really trying to get around the state. And then, of course, we do the Virginia Festival of the Book, which is our largest program. And that brings together dozens and dozens of authors each year for dozens of programs. We celebrate reading.
Well, without further ado, let's hear about the reading habits of college students.
I'm Cristina Griffin, and I'm an assistant professor of English.
And I'm Adrienne Ghaly, and I am also an assistant professor of English.
Okay, so you're here today because you were both very interested in the topic of what students' current reading habits are. What first brought you to ask this question?
I think we've both been interested in reading habits in our classes as teachers, right? We have both tried out different techniques and methods and exercises and assignments to help students think about their own reading, and it's something we've just talked about casually as colleagues and friends. And now that all of our students were in school in these formative years during the pandemic, we're realizing that these discussions about reading have taken on a new
Scale.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true for all of us, right? We all went through, we're all in the midst of this cultural shift in terms of our relationship with screens and distraction, the way we read. So I think it's something I think about personally for my own reading life a lot. It's something that I've thought about for my students a lot. And it's something we think, students benefit from having really deliberate conversations and dialogue around their own reading habits and help them get more excited about reading, or to realize that they're all equally excited about reading.
Yeah, I think for me, there is a there's always been a kind of an interest in reading practices, as Cristina said. But also I was given the opportunity to do a class under the tech sabbatical pilot. I ran a climate fiction course, and the idea was not only to have them read climate fiction as a way in to kind of talking about environmental and climate issues through long form storytelling, but also to have them think about how they read and how certain ways of reading, environments, scales of reading, and approaches might just help them do a little bit of a reset in the wake of many of the kind of cultural phenomena that Cristina just described. And I think students were pretty hungry for that. And so the tech sabbatical did really open my eyes to how many students are interested in and struggling with certain kinds of reading. So that's also kind of dovetailed with these conversations we've been having.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Could you kind of give me the scope of time of how long you've each been teaching and what you've just seen evidence of in your classes' behaviors? And were there key moments that really tipped you off of like, oh, something has shifted here?
So I would say two things stood out to me most recently from this class, and then I'll kind of do a broader sweep. So one of the things I did on the very first day was take students to the library, beautifully renovated library, and invited them to find whatever spot they wanted in whatever location. If they needed a little bit of chatter and background noise, go to the cafe. If they needed total, monastic silence, find a carol. Whatever they needed was like an ideal reading environment for them within the library, and to take an essay by Amitav Ghosh and to time themselves how long they could read the essay without disengaging from the text. If they looked up out the window and then looked back again and they didn't have to sort of re-immerse, quote unquote, that didn't count. It was when their distraction from reading was broken and then they had to sort of re-immerse that process, how long their sort of stamina was. And it was really interesting to me. And I chose an essay that was written in a fairly accessible style by a contemporary writer, but that did have some challenging material, right? Not too hard, but would require them to focus. And the sort of gamut ran from students who were able to go all 20 minutes without, they reported anyway, that they were able to do that without distraction and then having to reconnect and re-immerse. That was about a third of the class. About a third of the class could only go about 8 or 9 minutes, cresting on 10 minutes. And then a full third of the class could only do around 90 seconds. And that to me was really interesting because the students who could only do 90 seconds and the students who could only do sort of 8 to 9 minutes both said, I know that this is a problem and I do want to get better at this, but I'm not really sure how. And so we talked about reading environments. We talked about digital ecosystems as an environment, physical environments, and we talked about what each of them naturally gravitated toward. Do you read for little details? Do you read for big picture? Do you read for characters? Like, what is it that catches you when you're reading for something? What are you paying attention to, and what do you naturally gravitate toward? And can you train yourself in other kinds of things, reading for other kinds of things and at other scales? And by the end of the course, one of the students who was in the 90-second group said, I'm realizing that I'm putting myself in the wrong environments. I grew up in a very noisy household. I always thought that I needed lots of distraction and background noise. Otherwise, I couldn't focus. This was what I was sort of felt natural to me in my experience. But I realized that actually I can read for 2 hours straight if I'm in a distraction-free environment. And that was a real aha for me. Even though, you would say to a student, well, obviously, try and read in a distraction-free environment. But that really helped her. Another student said, I actually really hate sitting up in a chair. I find it really hard to read that way. So I actually find it better if I lie on the floor. I can read for much longer periods of time if I lie on the floor. And others realized that they're only reading for little details, little kind of snippets, or little kind of scrolling for kind of data gobbets, and that was impeding their ability to read in a way that they described as immersive. So that would be like the one piece. And then the second piece I would say is that, as an undergrad, as a student, even as like a high school student or middle school student, I could read a 400-page novel in a day. And I don't think I can do that anymore. And it's not that I don't have the ability to, but that other kinds of reading that I'm doing, where I'm zooming between different things, my email, right, my text messages from my family, my friends, all the different essays that I have open on my laptop, all the different projects I'm doing. I'm sort of multitasking too much to just sit and read a 400-page novel. And I think that I have kind of rewired my brain a little bit, because I'm privileging certain kinds of zooming between different kinds of textual material rather than sitting and just focusing on one. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to go back to that, I think.
I think it is. Yeah. One of the things I think we're both really interested in is defamiliarizing both ourselves and our students from their like habitual reading practices, so that we can think more open-mindedly and with more curiosity about like the ways we read. Is that how we want to read? Could we be reading differently? For me, despite having been, much like Adrienne, a child who read constantly and an English major, and then, got my PhD in English, I stopped reading outside of what I had to read for years. My list of like books that I would read annually that weren't like checking a box for work or for an orals list or for my dissertation or et cetera, or earlier in my career for teaching, was very low. And about 6 years ago, I remember, because it was when my middle child was born, I decided that I needed to fix that. And I needed to learn how to read again, not just for work, but for pleasure, and to like reacquaint myself with the porosity between reading for work and reading for pleasure, and that those can like interpenetrate. So I've really watched my own reading life change a lot in the last half dozen years, and it's been wonderful and fun. And I've tried to bring that like curiosity about reading habits into my classes. And I'd say the way I've approached reading in my classes has also influenced my own reading life. I was probably modeling more curiosity for my students in my classes than I was practicing in my own reading life, and then had to realize I should turn that attention inward and actually practice what I was preaching. In one of my classes that I've been teaching almost since the beginning of my time here at UVA, I really love teaching a novel. In this particular course, I teach a really long novel, like a 700-800-page novel, at the end of the class, and we read it piece by piece over about the course of a month. And the students are not allowed to write any assignments on that novel. So it's an English class. It's an upper division English class. They've read a whole bunch of other things. They've written a whole bunch of other things. But when we get to that book, we have finished the writing. And we are not reading to write a paper anymore. We are reading to read. We are reading to think. We are reading to be human beings with big brains and learn something. And they have this incredible experience of realizing the ways they pigeonhole themselves when they're reading a text. And their number one priority, understandably, is what will my thesis be about this? How will I memorize what I need to memorize in order to perform well in the exam? I started teaching that class and doing that novel exercise. I've done it with a few different novels before I learned how to read for pleasure again. And I really think it was doing that made me realize, I need to reacquaint myself with what it means to not read with like one particular agenda in mind. The other reading experience that I've really enjoyed curating for my students that has taught me a lot is I teach a Gothic literature class, and I work with a team of amazing librarians here at UVA, particularly including in special collections. And the students in the class have to each select a old Gothic novel or chapbook, basically like short story novella-sized stories, most of them from the late 18th to early 19th century, that have almost no digital footprint. So we have the world's largest and greatest collection of Gothic fiction here at the University of Virginia. And there are so many texts that most of them barely even exist online. So students have to pick a text that can only be read in person for the most part. Some of them have been digitized, but for the most part, they can only be read in person on like 200-plus-year-old paper. And the students have this incredible experience. They report to me at the end of the class. They love going and sitting in the reading room. They really enjoy the process of like putting their things in a locker, sitting down with just themselves and this old book and reading it in this really intimate way that, yeah, even if you're reading a book in, paper copy now, it's sort of lost because you also probably have your phone pinging right next to you. But when you're in the silent vault basement of special collections, you've like silenced all of that. When I designed that class, I didn't go into it thinking my goal is to create an immersive reading experience, but I ended up creating an immersive reading experience. And now that is part of a goal of the class and something I try and carry into other courses as well, because I think it is something the students are hungry for. Even we English professors don't make the time to do it. But I think it's an important reading practice and experience. And if we can't cultivate it for our students and ourselves, then I think we're going to all miss out on something.
Well, and also you're reporting that the class is doing something that the students at Brown that we had the conversation with really wanted.
They want it so desperately.
Yes. They kept reporting to us in our conversation with them that they're really reading for, what would you say, efficiency?
Yes, they're in like an efficiency paradigm.
Yeah.
We kept calling it Control F reading. Like they were like, there are things I need to get out of this reading, and I'm going to read in that way. And to be fair, that is a completely viable way to read. Like if you're reading for key information, that is a valuable way to read, to know these are the things, these are sort of the blanks I need to fill in my, Mad Libs in my brain of this content. But it isn't the only way to read. And I think what the students were reporting to us is that they've gotten so used to reading in this efficiency paradigm that then if they are ever offered the opportunity to step outside of that, like those muscles have atrophied a little bit. A lot.
Yeah.
And as I said, I mean, my muscles had atrophied for that too. So I very much understand it. And this is like my life's work. So, it's easy to fall into that efficiency paradigm. When we asked the students at Brown, when they'd been discussing these ways of reading with us, and we asked them, how many of you would be interested in like either courses or programming that really like reintroduce to you these like more immersive ways of reading, every single one of them raised their hands. So yeah, this is something that I think the students are eager for, and it would be nice to find more ways to give it to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine, a lot of students, they're taking a large course load. Mm-hmm. They're getting multiple reading assignments from each of those classes every week.
Absolutely.
And so something has to fall to the wayside, and that's like enjoyment.
Of course. And that's absolutely understandable.
Yeah.
I think we've all experienced that, right? We've all experienced, needing to use your time efficiently. And there are excellent reasons for that. I think our concern would be that is one of many ways to engage with the text, and it's not the only one. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times probably a few months ago now that was called something like, "Can you stare at this piece of art for 10 minutes?" And of course, looking at a piece of visual art is different than reading a book, but the same question was being asked, like, what is it like to kind of rest in an immersive experience that isn't based on efficiency, but is based on like deep immersion, curiosity, and like some degree of patience? How can we bring that back into some, not all, but some of the reading that our students are doing?
Yeah, and it also, it's when you're looking at that image in the New York Times, you have to look all around it many times. And in a way, it's a little bit of a parallel to reading as rereading, which is something that students often don't do. If you're using an efficiency paradigm, you're often not rereading. And if you're dealing with a text that is unfamiliar to you, that is a certain kind of poetry or genre that maybe you don't encounter very often or is wholly unfamiliar to you, reading has to be rereading. And so to say, yes, it is about pleasure and it is about immersion, but it's also just about getting more flexible with the ways you can approach different kinds of texts. And we haven't really talked about genre, but that was something that students reported, that they were familiar with certain kinds of genres, but really unfamiliar with others. And genre, I'm talking in the largest possible sense of that, from like a scientific abstract, right, to a sestina. And that encountering unfamiliar genres, they felt very unprepared. That their high school experience certainly had left them unprepared for certain kinds of reading, in part because, the knowledge production of universities are different, and also because for some of them, it was clear that there's a very uneven playing field in terms of what they've been exposed to and what they haven't, depending on where they went to school and what that school's specialty or focus was.
I want to ask more about your meeting with the students at Brown College. You've already mentioned a few things, but what were some other big takeaways from that conversation?
So we talked a little bit about the genre issue. We talked a little bit about everyone wanting to read more immersively. But one of the things we maybe haven't talked about is that reading can be really amazing if it is collective. And that's something that we had talked to them a little bit about, because we have this idea that reading, yes, it has to happen in the classroom. The classroom is where there's a focus. But we're really talking, and I give Cristina credit for envisioning the project this way, which is that we're actually talking about a culture shift in reading that we want to affect with our students. And that means reading beyond the classroom. And so one of the things we proposed to them was, what if we all got together and everybody brought a book they really wanted to read, and we sit in Brown College and you find a comfortable place and everybody reads for maybe 45 minutes, and then we get up and have some food and something to drink, and we all chat to each other about what we've been reading. And we could do it with the same book, but we could also do it with very different kinds of materials. And they really loved that idea.
They loved the idea.
Yeah.
And you could tell some of them had been talking about how they wish they were doing more pleasure reading, and were like, oh, I would maybe use that as an opportunity to like carve out time. And others were like, oh, that would actually give me an opportunity to immersively read, this scientific paper that I've been wanting to revisit but haven't had a chance to. I think we've been calling them reading parties. I think we really like this idea, and the students really like this idea of making reading something that can be, as Adrienne said, collective, something that can be social, something that can be visible in new ways on grounds, that it's not something that you have to like only do individually and on your own time and outside of the classroom. I'm teaching a J-term class at the top of 2025, and we're going to be doing a lot of reading during class. And that's something I've not really done before, but I really want to play around with it because I think it'll be really fun and interesting, and J-term feels like the perfect time to try more in-class reading. So we're going to do some reading parties in J-term, and inspired in part by this conversation with the Brown students, and see, in that class we'll all be reading the same things, but it was inspired by that conversation with students and their eagerness. I thought, well, I'll test this out in my classroom. See where it goes.
When I say to people, we're thinking about reading, people who are in the education field, they get it, because everyone is seeing a lot of shifts in reading practices and students struggling with reading.
And I've heard the same from my engineering friends who say, oh, yes. They have also said, my students need this, my grad students need this, and I would benefit from this.
Yes.
Like, I think we're seeing the same experience across several disciplines of, this isn't just like an English majors thing. This is like,
it's not even a humanities
to be
thing.
human is to read. Obviously, we're biased when we say that, but I think Adrienne and I both really believe that reading is a fundamental part of the way we engage with the world, and that's not as English majors. That's just as human beings. So this is across a pan-university quest.
Yeah, a quest. And this is also a moment where AI is increasingly available to students to supplement some of these skills gaps that they clearly feel they have. And if you're on an efficiency paradigm, asking an AI to summarize a text for you is one way that students are dealing with reading skills gaps or or not having enough time to do the reading, the time that they would individually need to do a certain set of readings. And so that's also what's kind of interesting is that the tech sabbatical, which is supposed to sort of be a moment where they can sort of step away from these digital ecosystems and read print material and do so to sort of expand their different ways of reading and their stamina, is kind of colliding with these ways that the AI, quote unquote, reads. But it's really spurred a lot of great conversations. It's like, well, okay, if you're going to say, what is this text about, right? Aboutness has all these different frames for it, right? And so the AI is going to prioritize certain things, but you would potentially prioritize and look at other things that you think are really important. And so it's also that this whole conversation about reading is happening in this much wider kind of cultural moment where other things are shifting in education and technology that is feeding into these issues. So it feels like a good time to do this.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah. Everything you guys are saying is totally resonating with me. I was like a huge reader all through my childhood. I grew up in the middle of nowhere where like reading was like the main hot thing to do, And then I got to college and it was like, why would I be reading right now? Like I need to experience other people. And so the idea of a reading party is really lovely. A lot of adults only get back into reading through book clubs and stuff like that.
There's a reason the book club is a cultural phenomenon, right? People really want to do reading and they want to do it together and they want to do it with stories that really grab them. But they also want to practice, right? This pleasurable practice of reading, and the social element of that is a huge component.
Yeah.
I'm part of a book club. I also run a book club. So,
Same.
Because, and in
Her
addition
life is a
to
professional book club.
in addition to the work that, that we do. And so, one of the ideas too is to sort of take one of the book clubs that I work on with a professor of public policy and maybe embed that, in the residential colleges,
program, right?
So that students they're connecting their reading to wider socio-historical, cultural, and kind of urgent, what feels for them to be urgent, like climate change or humanitarian crises, and that reading stories about this is a good way to actually come together, to have a common object to discuss these things that are really hard to discuss, actually.
Right.
So,
there is this, I guess it's both a trope and also a reality, depending on our own lived experiences, that reading is antithetical to like being in the world, right? Like that to read is to like retreat from the world and be behind a book. And I mean, I think that can be the case, and sometimes productively. Sometimes you need to retreat from the world, and sometimes a book can be a way to do that. But equally so, a book can be another entry into the world, and a book can be an entry into a communal experience. And the book club paradigm is, based on that very fact that reading doesn't have to be isolated. It can actually be an entry point to sociability.
I wanted to ask just a little bit more about AI. It sounds like students do see AI as like a way to supplement things that they're not able to, or at least perceive that they're not able to access. What do you think about that? What does that make you feel as a professor?
I think the question that Adrienne brought up earlier about aboutness is a really fascinating one in relation to AI, because one of the things I think AI can be okay at is the summary or the synthesis, depending on the initial document. In a writing class that I recently taught, I had students take their own work, put it into an AI system, and ask it to produce a summary, and we all generally agreed it can do that. Sometimes it does it pretty well. Sometimes it does it pretty poorly. There are issues, like it takes away personality and yada yada. The main thing is it's an interpretation, right? A summary is always an interpretation, right? And it was really interesting to see that some students said, oh, the AI interpreted my work the same way I would have and wrote the same kind of summary, and others was like, oh, this is not at all how I would have summarized it, although it's a technically valid one. But yeah, this question of aboutness, of like, what is something about? What does it make us think of? What is like the larger world that it exists in? That feels, and I think is, something that AI can't grapple with. And I don't know from the technical standpoint, but it doesn't seem like something that AI will ever be able to grapple with. So I wonder if AI will create more distinctions between different modes of reading. So like if you are reading for particular information that could hypothetically be pulled out in a kind of control F efficiency paradigm or AI paradigm, then yeah, hypothetically putting an article in and saying, what are the 5 main points? Maybe AI could produce the same 5 main points. I still don't know that that counts as reading. That counts as summarizing, which is not really the same task. But you might produce the same end. But I think if I ask AI, you know, what is the novel there about, there are a million answers to that. And AI can give one, but it takes a human brain to really understand the milieu of answers. And so in that sense, I don't feel worried about AI replacing certain types of reading. And I think it could actually just help us to distinguish between efficiency and non-efficiency paradigms, or reading that might have particular answers and readings that have or forms of reading that have multitudes of answers.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost like the students reading for efficiency and reading in this sort of control F way they have already mastered the kind of reading that AI does.
Sure.
They don't need the AI.
Correct.
Right? But the AI can't do these other kinds of reading.
Yeah.
And so you're sort of like, well, you have optimized yourself to the things that AI is optimized for, but actually there's all these other ways of reading that AI can't do. I mean, I'll give an example that is, a kind of a co-creative process that I had my students do, which is that we read a bunch of object poems by a French mid-20th century author. And they were poems praising pebbles and doors and cigarettes and rain and very kind of common everyday objects and materials. And then the students had to co-create their own version with their own object with AI. And they had to understand the literary strategies and devices that this poet used in order to produce those poems, for them to produce their own version with their own object. And it was really interesting that once you got into issues like tone or emotion or sort of comparisons or juxtapositions that were startling or original, that the AI very quickly, was very disappointing and was very sort of Hallmark card in its responses. And they really had to struggle to get it to co-create something that they felt met a standard, for them that was closer to how this poet would write. And so they got a really great education in how actually really innovative this poet was in his use of language, precisely in comparison and contrast to how unoriginal, right, and synthetic the AI was. And so often these exercises of comparison, the AI reads for this, you read for that, right? The AI can produce these kinds of examples, but how are they actually very radically different from this other example? Once you put the students in a position of friction with AI, they produce really great work because they're able to sort of get inside their own thinking process and walk around in the kind of creativity of their own understanding of some kind of creative process or creative, artifact, and then realize that AI is not, it really cannot do anything remotely close to what they can do. It can predict the average of thought, right? That's what it can do. And that might be useful in some circumstances. I find it quite helpful to have AI give me a quick rundown of some abstracts, right, on a particular topic. It's a shortcut for certain things. But then I'm going to go back and read those articles that actually look pretty interesting, right? So what are you going to, quote unquote, outsource? And what is really not ever outsourceable in terms of your own engagement? I think that's what they learn. What's a little concerning is that the Brown College students reported, all of them, that they often see students in the library with AI open and they're copying and pasting, chunks to get a summary or sort of set of key takeaways. And then you sort of wonder, well, how is there's kind of like a fuzziness there in terms of what text maybe, one shouldn't really go there as the first sort of entry point into grappling with a text. So, but then of course we have to think about these structural issues, right? How many classes are they taking? How much workload they have? I mean, I don't assign workload thinking about my colleagues' workload, right? I assign what I need to assign for my course. And so, there's always going to be these calculations that students make. And and also many of them are working, many of them are working more than one job. There are all kinds of pressures on them that are producing the efficiency paradigm. It's not because they don't often want to do the work, right? So also thinking about these structural elements and then thinking about how to course correct in my own syllabus, right? So that their pressure points aren't coming at the same time for large loads of reading as, say, like midterms, for example, right?
Right.
That will help them
absolutely
do better reading, right?
Right.
This is like such potent information that I think will resonate with a lot of people. How do we confront it and change or develop with this changing media landscape that kind of puts us into a place of efficiency and not necessarily picking up books? What's the next step?
Christina has a vision.
You do?
Well, we have a vision.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a real desire and a vision for, as Adrienne said before, a cultural shift at UVA, where reading isn't something that only happens in an efficiency paradigm, where reading isn't something that only happens hidden in, behind a door. But where reading is something we are delighting in and engaging in on multiple levels with new practices, reinvigorating some of the practices that we've been using, that students have been using since high school, and also recognizing that the new environment that they are in and the new types of classes they are taking means looking at reading from a new lens and learning some new practices. So we would like to see a real shift in our just sort of collective commitment to reading as a fundamental skill, not on the level of literacy, because all of our students come in like with the capacity to read, but really valuing the practices and approaches and methods and giving students the space to practice them in their classes and outside of their classes, so that reading isn't something we take for granted, but is something we actively cultivate for our students and allow to be a really solid foundation. UVA has done a really excellent job with writing, recognizing that it is a central and essential skill, that is a foundational skill, and building that into curriculum across the board, both inside and outside the classroom. And we would like to see a similar movement happen with reading. And I think that similarly, it would need to happen both in the classroom, providing more resources to faculty to have these sort of like meta moments about thinking about reading in their classes, explicitly teaching students new methods, more student support on practicing those methods, and then the fun part of reading, whether it's reading parties where students are reading whatever they'd like, but doing it communally, or maybe some more collective reading of all the same text, collective reading practices like Adrienne mentioned with the climate book club, where reading is like an explicit part of the world. We think that that kind of multi-layered approach could really help generate an exciting cultural shift where all who's are reading and quite enjoying it.
I think my colleague Alex Prigozhin, he's at the University of Utrecht, really nailed it when we were talking about the struggles we were having with our students and what kinds of reading they seemed able to do and what text felt very resistant. They were very resistant to. And he said it's almost as if we need not just a content syllabus, but we also need a skill set syllabus. We've recognized it for writing, but not for reading, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about how to build some of those reading skills into the curriculum in a really intentional way, I think, that I don't actually think it's a huge lift, but it has to be sort of scaffolded. And people are used to doing that with their writing assignments, but we're realizing that we also have to do it with our reading assignments. Not for everybody and not for every text, but
certainly we can all benefit.
Yeah.
As I think we have both experienced in our own reading lives and just in our lives as curious, open-minded human beings, like reconnecting with fundamental skills and learning new methods and approaches is almost always a good idea.
Yeah.
So it has worked for writing, and I think it can work wonders for reading too.
Watch this space, because I think a lot of our faculty, colleagues and friends and students, when we say the project to people and say this is what we're thinking about, I think we've had 100% of people saying yes, this is a thing and is cresting into visibility. But the question of sort of where we go next and how we're going to do it, we're still determining that. Yeah.
At the beginning of the road.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm joined by Kalela Williams, the director of the Virginia Center for the Book. In this digital age, have you ever felt like you're reading less than you used to?
I actually feel like I'm reading more in a way, because this digital age is actually giving us more opportunities to read. For instance, right now, if one were to look at my life, I have a book on my nightstand. It's a hardback. I have an audiobook. Well, actually, I have a couple of audiobooks that I'm listening to. I also have a book that I'm reading digitally. So I am consuming books in every single way that there is.
And if someone out there is listening and they feel like they've really disconnected from reading or a love of books that they might have had as a child, do you have any advice for them?
Yeah. I think that, many of us were isolated during the pandemic, and I think that has collectively affected our experience of reading. And I think that many of us, we have shorter attention spans, we have more things going on, we have a lot of thoughts that might be outside of, we think, I just can't focus. But the thing is, there are so many ways to get into reading. As I mentioned, there's the audiobooks and there's digital books, and there's always a way that you can fit books into your life. Our local library, for instance, if you don't want to spend money on a book, use bookstores. If you just want to buy something, just pick up something for a few dollars, you can go up to a bookseller and say, hey, I'm interested in so-and-so, what can I read? Booksellers love talking about books. They will always have suggestions for you. So I think that this is really a great time to tune back in to reading.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. One more time, tell us how we can find out more information, both about the Center for the Book and the Festival of the Book.
Everything that you want to find out is on vabook.org. Again, that is vabook.org.
Special thanks to Adrienne Ghaly, Cristina Griffin, and Kalela Williams. Symposia is a production of Brown Residential College at the University of Virginia and the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM. Tell your friends to find us wherever they get their podcasts.